All right. And three, two, and one.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dana from Project Arc. And if you've watched our DisT podcast before, you know what's coming next. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we got here and a little bit about me as well. So, many of you probably know me from my work in pushing project-based learning into more of an authentic space so that learners really have that opportunity to affect real change in their world. And in fact, the ARC in Project ARC stands for authenticity, relevancy, and community connection. So for the past 20 years, give or take, this work has really been my passion, and the journey has been rewarding, yet bumpy at times. And last November, I just put out a call on LinkedIn that said, hey, connect with me if you consider yourself to be a disagreeable person in the education space. I had no idea what the response was going to be, but the post itself was prompted by a quote from Adam Grant's bestseller book, Think Again, The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know. And so I want to take a moment and just read the quote that I pulled from the book. And it says, the ideal members of a challenge network are disagreeable because they're fearless about questioning the way things have always been done and holding us accountable for thinking again. There's evidence that disagreeable people speak up more frequently, especially when leaders aren't receptive, and foster more task conflict. And so the whole premise of that is that task conflict then gets things done. So, our guests today on our podcast and in the future may disagree with myself, may disagree with Tim, may disagree with each other. Doesn't necessarily constitute an endorsement by Project ARC, but Tim and I really wanted to use this opportunity to learn and grow as we think again, because we have no idea what our guests are going to say, even though we know some of them. And I'll just throw it out here that we're kind of in a space and place today where we're feeling a little displaced, maybe as educators. And it takes us back, at least for Tim and Mike and I, it takes us back to the pandemic because we hosted a series of conversations called Displaced, and Mike did a great job facilitating those for us. And when Tim and I were talking about, well, where does this disagreeableness go? We said, well, we don't want to necessarily repeat Displaced. We wanted to do something else, and Dist was born. But definitely feel in that space of being displaced in terms of education today. And Tim, I know that you've got some Dist words as well.
All right. Thanks, Dana. And a big thanks to our guests, Mike Ritzius, Nadene Klein, and Sara Bradley, who are joining us tonight. My name's Tim Kubik. I'm also with Project ARC. I live in Northern Colorado. And it's cold. Don't move here. Um,
Cold
um,
in Pennsylvania too.
yeah. Um, but we're really glad to have our three guests on tonight. Some of them we know, some of them are new folks for us. To get our conversation going, I'm going to do some of the moderating through the course of the day and sort of hold my Disword up my sleeve until I feel like it's the right time to deploy it. But I'd love to invite our guest, Sara Bradley from Pennsylvania, to kick us off first. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Sara, and what's your Disword to start our conversation?
Yeah, so thank you for having me. I am appreciative of a space where we can have candid, authentic conversations about what's happening in education without fear of repercussion. So this is a very nice opportunity. So thank you. Sara Bradley, I am here in York, Pennsylvania. I maybe have a little bit of a different lens of education. I have been an early childhood professional for 25 years. I have worked at the program, county, and state level here in Pennsylvania, as well as served as a school board member. And I also teach graduate courses at Penn State in the education administration. So my dis word for this podcast is disenchanted, with a lot of systems across the educational spectrum, but I will leave it right there. Unless you want me to go further and talk more about that, or if you want everyone to introduce their DIS words.
Yeah, let's hear from everybody else, and then we can
Okay.
build on what you shared there with disenchantment with systems.
Sure.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to go to Mike.
Hi, thanks for having me on. It's really nice to be in a place where I can be my disagreeable self and it's invited. Um, so I've been in education since 2000. I was instrumental in the Ed Camp movement, and my current role is at the New Jersey Education Association. I am the program manager for the New Jersey Labor Management Collaborative, where we work with whole leadership teams in districts to help rethink how decisions get made in those districts in a way that's participatory and inclusive. My dis word is discordant.
You want to just drop that bomb and leave it?
I'm
Yeah,
just going to drop it and leave it. Yeah.
All right. I didn't see
I
the
create a
mic
lot of
drop
discord.
yesterday, so-
Yeah.
I gotta say, so far we've got some new DIS words coming in
Yeah.
compared to past times, so this is great.
No, it's really good. All right. Our third guest is Nadene Klein from Southern Colorado. Nadine.
Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be with you all and to be able to share our conversations with like-minded people, or at least people who want to have the space to have these kinds of conversations. I greatly appreciate that. I've been in education since 1991. I'm finishing up my 28th year in the classroom at the moment, and I have taught everything from kindergarten through high school. Most of my years were spent at the middle school level, and right now I'm in my 8th year at an alternative high school working with at-risk youth, teaching science, psychology, and being an outdoor ed lead for them. On the side, I do educational consulting, professional development, instructional coaching, and I'm on the board of directors of a non-for-profit STEM preschool that serves underprivileged kids in the Denver metro area. So lots of experience. I've dedicated my whole life to education, and my dis word, unfortunately, is disparity. Mic drop. Okay.
Mic drop. Okay, we got lots of mic drops today. One word and done. So, um, disenchanted, disparity, and discordant. Um, I don't know why, but I'm like picking up a music vibe. Maybe it's because I said we were going to have some jazz here today, right? But I think about discordance. I think about uh, the opposite of disenchantment is enchantment, right? And as part of the theme of this podcast is the belief, is an old Greek saying that I'll just throw in here because I'm kind of a geek like that. Tones at a variance make the best harmony, right? Um, and I hear that in discordant. I also hear that in disenchanted a little bit because sometimes tones at a variance can be kind of painful, like fingers on a chalkboard. But I'm curious to see how the word disparity fits into that theme of um, a vibe or music. And what is it about disparity, Nadine, that that makes uh, the music painful to hear sometimes?
Yeah. Well, in education, we know every child and every professional comes to us with their own background, their own experiences, and um, we've hoped that the Department of Education would eliminate disparity so that everybody comes to us in an equal playing field and has the opportunity to learn in the manner that best suits them. And so in the field of music, right, everybody can sing their own song, can play their own music, and reach a sense of harmony with everybody else around them. But unfortunately, that doesn't happen the way that it should. So uh, there's some work to be done there still.
Fair enough. I love the focus on the unique backgrounds and the unique experiences that all of us bring. Um, and the tension that I hear there, and I invite either Sarah or Mike to pick up on it, um, between that and the notion of an equal playing field, right? Like in theory, we should have a playing field that everybody can stand on and shine, right? But a lot of times it seems like what we do is try to make everybody equal first before we start teaching them and educating them and bringing them up, right? We try to establish a baseline of some sort. Um, and that leads to a lot of discord. Um, we mentioned earlier the problems of students not wanting to just sort of sit and be taught, right? Before we got into the actual conversation, right? Whether we want to use the unfortunate phrase feral children or not, I'm not so sure. Um, but what is it about the systems? Maybe I'll go to Sarah, right? What is it about the systems um, that kind of make a lot of people feel like their unique background, their unique contribution, their actual disagreeability isn't actually valued in our systems of education?
So I'm happy, Nadine, I'm happy to hear that you have a nonprofit early learning background. That's where I came from too. So I'm glad that there's additional perspective on this on here. I honestly feel like disparities have gotten worse since COVID. I know Dana brought that up in the beginning, this idea of being displaced that feels, and I'll even use my word, even more disenchanting since we had COVID. I can tell you that I think it is worse than ever, the disparities that we're seeing between youth that are coming into these programs, the accessibility that these kids have to one, core parent structures or core family structures, all the way to the baseline knowledge that they have come in, social emotional learning capabilities. Literally all the way through the lack of communication between the formal structures. I can speak for here in Pennsylvania. We have over 500 school districts that all, I will call them individual fiefdoms.
Yep.
And so there is
Not
very
wrong.
much a disjoint, and I know Dana's here in Pennsylvania with me as well. Even my program currently services kids from 7 different school districts. So even the very local disjointment that we are seeing here and the disparities between where our kids are going and what is available to them is more prominent than ever.
Mike, you want to jump in on that a little bit?
I do, and the thing that struck me in your question is that you were really pointed about naming systems in that, and that's where I feel like the discordant is. Like, I feel like everybody really wants to do a good job, but the system is not oriented in a way to help them do that, you know. And so like all these disparities start to show up, and it leads to this disenchantment. Because the system isn't supportive of folks. You know, like we talk about how important it is to grow this sense of collective efficacy and to be collaborative across our buildings. But when you look at how schools orient, everybody goes to a room, they work by themselves, they're buried in a ton of like paperwork that has to happen during the preps. You barely even have time to go to the restroom. And so like the discordance is like we know what we need to do and we know what really works, but we're in these structures that do the exact opposite. You know, and so how do we start to harmonize the system with the needs of the folks who are there, so that we can get better outcomes for kids?
And where do we even start when you're looking at, I know Tim's shaking his head when I say that, but where do you start? Do you start at a higher level and work the way down? Or do you start in individual programs and kind of lift the ceiling up to those higher level decision makers? It's a continual conversation that we're having here in Pennsylvania, and I know it's not unique across the country.
Mhm.
Well, and I need to agree as well. Like, as teachers, we're very siloed, but even from the student perspective, the content that they're learning when they get to secondary school is siloed as well. And they don't often instinctively notice the interconnectedness of the different content that they're learning. I was having a conversation with students today. In your real life, you don't say, okay, I'm having 15 minutes now where I'm going to read, and then I'm done reading, and then I go over here to this other space and I do math, and that's where I do math, right? And everything is kind of disaggregated. It would be nice to have it all aggregated together. And where does that change happen, from the bottom up or the top down? And we continue to have this disparity because kids are coming to us from different backgrounds. And it was the Department of Education at the national level was formed in 1979 to kind of even the playing field, or to bring equity to education throughout the entire country, and putting systems and actions in place like IDEA and Title I, Title IX, those things helped for sure. And so then I'm wondering about dismantling the federal Department of Education and where that's going to lie, because it hasn't been fully successful. And is that just going to get worse, or is somebody going to pick up the ball and run with it? And maybe at the state level, we can either start to build from the bottom up, or from the top down, or from the in out. You're right. Which way do you go? How do you start?
And who decides that when you're in a state like Pennsylvania, where there's 500 individual decision-making groups all working on what best practice looks like for their individual stakeholders,
And then you
and
have
not necessarily reflective of the community they're serving.
right.
Yeah.
And then you
I
have
think
50
it's
that might
501.
approach it differently too.
So I love that you introduced the question of dismantling. Nadine, I'm sure that's something that's on a lot of people's minds right now. I just have a message that my internet may be dismantling, and I apologize if I get glitchy. It says I'm unstable. I love that Zoom always says that. You may be unstable now. But I'm just going to throw out this bomb, right? I'm gonna pick my dis word out, because as I was hearing disaggregated, dismantling, and we've talked about disenchantment with the system, and I'm going to throw this to anybody who wants to field it. Um, are education systems actually disintegrating at the moment under all these different tensions that we're playing with? In that there isn't that kind of central control anymore anywhere, right?
And is that a good or a bad thing?
Yeah, I'm just we can say disintegrating, disintegration, but is what we're seeing actually the disintegration of systems that worked in the 20th century, but maybe they're disintegrating.
I think we are going through, I'm sorry, go ahead, Nadine. Do you want to go?
Keep going.
I think the next 50 years in education are going to be very different. I do not know if what is currently happening with the breakdown of traditional systems is a good or bad thing. I don't think we will know that for a while. But I can speak to the fact that our public school systems are rapidly dismantling with the increased level of choice that parents have as to how their children are being educated. There are pros and cons with having those level of choice. When you have kindergarteners in front of screens who are learning to read for 5 to 7 hours a day, is that a good or bad thing? There are pros and cons with every level of education and how we're administering it. But I think it's something that's yet to be seen, and there's not enough research at this point to tell us one way or the other.
All right, Nadine, you had wanted to get in on this too. Are we disintegrating?
Possibly. And the question is that good or bad? To a certain level, you want to have some accountability, so that when you hear a kid graduated from high school, whether they did that in Pennsylvania where you are, or in Colorado where I am, or Alabama, or anywhere in the country, that they all have certain skills and knowledge level that's been built. But at the same time, our systems are terribly broken, and these kids have to know all the same things that schools were set up to teach in the 20th century, right? Maybe we need to shake things up and bring more innovation into the classrooms and help students prepare for their futures in a completely different way than we have been. And we hear accolades for places like High Tech High, or, and I often hear about compliments for my alternative high school for teaching kids in a different way. And all schools should be like that. So maybe this is what we need to shake it up to get to that point. Sometimes you have to get uncomfortable and have some discontent in order to make changes for the greater good.
Yeah. Mike or Dana, any thoughts on disintegration?
Yeah, I don't know how I feel about that word, disintegration. I'm looking for a dis word, and I don't have it. But yeah, there's definitely like tension that schools have always experienced, and I feel like they adapt in really different ways. And like each state has has different ability to adapt. Like we have some states that are really centralized, and each district is a county. Sarah, just like New Pennsylvania, New Jersey, we have 600 school districts. I feel like a state like that is actually a little more resilient because there's so many little laboratories for things to happen and wrestle with those changes. And you think about all the like cataclysmic changes that hit schools. Just since I've been in education, I started in 2000. I was looked at as a very tech proficient person because I could put hyperlinks into PowerPoint slides. And then we go from there. We have cell phones, and then there's social media, and then there's the Great Recession hits, and then COVID. Now we have AI. Like every couple of years, something is a new revolution, and schools are still going. And there's lots of places that are doing really amazing things with that too. So I don't know if it's a disintegration per se, but there's definitely some kind of major changes that happen, and some schools are better positioned to deal with it than others are. And going back to that discordant one, that lack of harmony, if schools and education systems were really, instead of focused on like um like having the one right way to do it, if they accepted that idea that they are places of learning and that there are systems that learn, um we would be much better able to weather this stuff in a cohesive way rather than the disjointed way that happens in some of these schools that are really shining and some that aren't.
And you mentioned AI, and not to turn this into an AI conversation because I know it's been the subject of conversation in past this podcast, but we get to this place where something occurs, and this is what's going to change and revolutionize education, and yet we're still exactly where we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago. And it just makes me wonder what is that push that is going to happen, needs to happen to make that shift and change. Because if you look at the AI systems as they are currently and all of the ed tech money that is going into AI, it's just perpetuating everything that we've done previously, and it's not hitting that redefinition level of SAMR in any way, shape, or form. And so if we are dismantling, does that help with some of the disparities, or does that perpetuate the disparities? And I would agree, it's going to take years for this to play out, but in 2020, we thought that was it. That was the moment. Things are going to change, and we're still where we are in terms of a lot of places and pieces of education.
Well, back where we were, yeah. And Mike, I really like that you introduced this question of adaptability and resiliency. Because of 600 districts or because of 500 districts. I think Nadine, in Colorado, we only have like 187 or something, right? Nowhere near that many. But I'm wondering if disparity doesn't play a role in sort of limiting that adaptability and resilience, but in a paradoxical way. I'm going to throw this out because, we find ourselves as people, as Project Arc, offering a different approach to learning than the traditional approach to learning. We find ourselves working with a lot of schools that are on turnaround, and are really locked down tight. They don't have much adaptability or resiliency. They've got the gun at their head, basically saying, improve your test scores or else. And they've tried everything else. So they'll come and try working with us, right? And the schools that we sometimes have the most difficulty breaking into, the ones that seem to have the least adaptability and the least resiliency, are the schools where everything's hunky-dory, right? Like the kids go to good colleges, the grades are good, right? And it's sort of like, no, we don't want to change anything. We're just going to keep it exactly the way it is because it works. I mean, have other people had that experience that there are disparities given the system and the way the system looks at schools that make it harder for some schools to be adaptable and change to the realities that they may be seeing?
human
Yeah, see
nature.
that all the time.
Yeah, it's human
Uh,
nature to follow the path of least resistance. And if you don't have to change, if things ain't broke, don't fix them kind of an attitude. And so um, why bother making those kinds of changes, right? If and I've always said too with education, everybody has gone to public school at some point, right? Or most everybody's gone to public school. And so they think I spent 13 years going from kindergarten until I graduated high school. And I saw a bunch of teachers. I know what the profession is. And they're more likely to judge and say, this is how it was when I was a kid. This is how it should be. This is what was good. This is what was bad. They'd never walk into a doctor's office and say that. They'd never walk into a courtroom and tell a lawyer how to do their job. But they feel like they've had enough experience firsthand in the context of a school that they can say that. And so we're stuck in this rut of this constructed expectation of what school should look like and how it should be. And again, why change it if that's how it's always been?
Mike, did you
Yeah,
want to
I
jump
think
in
the
on that a
flip
little
side of
bit?
that is true too. So you have the places that like by the standard measures um don't measure up, and so they're like, what's the risk here? There is no risk, like we have nothing to lose. So let's try some innovative stuff. Whereas the ones that meet or exceed the standardized measures that everybody thinks makes a good school, um, it's a much larger risk to try and do things differently and try something new, because then the parents descend upon you and that kind of thing. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, it's something we see all the time. And I think back to my teaching days. I worked at a countywide VOTEC in Jersey, which are kind of special things. And we had 34 districts that fed into us. We're a high school only district. We had lots of kids who were not there for academic reasons, and we tried to stuff them into a traditional academic program, and we constantly failed. And when we tried to do away with that, and we started asking real questions like, well, what are we really doing here? Like, what do we need to do in order to meet the needs of kids? We realized most of the system was just not there to meet the needs of kids. It was just compliance oriented nonsense. When
Mhm.
we threw all that out, our kids were right up there with the rest of them, passing the tests and just really shining as individuals. It was a cool experiment to be able to take part in.
Well, I'm glad you give us that glimmer of hope with all the dis words flying around, right? I think it's really true. Um, and I wanted to ask Sarah, you talked about your disenchantment. Where do we find disenchanted students? Which types of schools are we likely to find those disenchanted students? Or maybe I'll ask Nadine, right? Nadine, are your students in your alternative school disenchanted with the system in the way they might have been when they were in the traditional public school before coming to your school? Or where's the disenchantment?
They very
I'll
much
let
are
Sarah
disenchanted with the yeah
go
with the
ahead,
school
Nadine.
system. Yeah, they're very disenchanted with the school system. They feel like their traditional schools failed them, didn't recognize them as individuals or meet their needs, whether it was because they have mental health issues, physical health issues, they're trauma survivors. Everybody automatically thinks kids who end up in an alternative school are criminals, and that isn't necessarily the case. We have a lot of students who were bullied, who are members of the LGBTQ community and just didn't feel like they were accepted and honored for who they were. And they find a home with us. Sometimes we call ourselves the land of the misfit toys, right?
Yep.
And when they see that they're valued as a human being and that their needs are going to be met, those relationships are built, and then they thrive. And I think that piggybacks on what Mike was saying just a moment ago is, we could throw out the traditional rule book because we're graduating 80% of the kids who come to us when 100% of them were not expected to graduate. And that
Right.
probably begins in early childhood, right? So Sarah can speak to that. If we don't meet their needs when they're little guys, that just manifests in even greater ways as they age.
Yeah,
It
and
absolutely does. Go ahead, Dana.
No, I was just going to say, and I'm super interested in hearing what you have to say about that early childhood component because I just wrote a response to an RFP for a middle school, and part of the research that I had in there was, this percentage of the elementary students that feel that they're engaged in school and they like it, and by the time they get to high school, so what happens? Something in between, middle school. So I'm just really interested to hear what those little ones are coming to you with in terms of enchantment or disenchantment. Is it different for the different school districts that you're drawing from? Because there's a
So
disparity.
So all kids are born ready to learn.
Mhm.
So from the time that they come into the world, they are ready to learn. Their brains are the most, I will say, malleable in those first 5 years of life.
Mhm.
Some research will tell us through age of 8. So the most, we need to get as much information to them as possible and as many experiences as possible as we can before that rigidity sets in about third grade in the public school system. I know I'm speaking to the choir on that. I know everyone on this call knows that. But what we are seeing in early learning and what we can help identify, and this is where prevention services really come in, is I can tell you by the age of 3 what students need those preventative measures so that way they come into the public school system ready to learn. And what I
Mhm.
mean by that is that they can sit for a period of time and listen, because the way kindergartners were traditionally taught, uh, I will say 50 years ago was very different from how they're taught today. The academic concepts have significantly been pushed down.
Right.
Although we promote learning through play, that becomes more and more difficult as academic and rigorous standards are coming down to the early learning levels. Um, I mean, we see it very, very early, Dana. I know Nadine can attest to that as well, and the work that she's doing and the board work that she's doing. But I also think there's another role to play here, and that's the disenchantment and the extreme desertion of the
Mhm.
teaching field and the lack of consistent teaching staff over the course of a child's education career, at least in the public systems, as well as leadership for those districts. Mike was spot on when he talked about these little think tanks where you can have innovative measures that play out. But if you don't have consistent teaching staff and consistent leadership, there is no time built into those schedules. You're just trying to keep the boat from sinking. And we're seeing more and more of that here in Pennsylvania. Teachers are leaving the field, early learning all the way through, and even I will say higher education,
Mhm.
are leaving at a rapid rate to do
Yeah.
other things with their profession. So I think until we have solid, and I will say, even say enchanted leadership in schools and teaching staff, we are going to continue to see disenchantment amongst kids within those systems.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the word Dana used in DIS2 was disgust, right? That a
Yeah.
lot of teachers have for the systems that they're in now and the way they see kids treated. Obviously, that's being exacerbated by the disparities that Nadine has
Yes.
talked about. Um, and it is leading to a space where teachers feel they need to be discordant or disagreeable voices in their communities, right? And calling out their schools, their state systems, right? Because of what they are doing to kids, what they are doing to them. And we hope to invite more and more of those folks to join us here to be part of that conversation, because we really do want to hear from them. But let's just sort of head into a wrap on this question of, um, we've been talking mostly about systems and students, and then Sarah opened up teachers. And um, some are being dismissed, both literally and figuratively, right? Sort of like they're being fired or they're being dismissed as being relevant anymore. What are people's thoughts about the way that the treatment of teachers in the last 5 years or so is part of the discord that we're seeing in the system?
Yeah, I'd like to hop in on that one. I think
I
I
figured
think
you would,
yes, yes, as putting my union hat on. Um, the the idea that I would like to disrupt the most is that we need to is that the adults need to focus on the kids, because the kids are a how kids perform in schools is a responding variable to the thing that we can control, and that's how well the adults work together and associate with each other. And so when people say it's about the kids, I hear that as kind of a cynical, abusive statement to make. It's really about the adults. Like, how do we care for and nurture the professionals so they can do their jobs in the way that they need to be done. We should not be grinding up the teachers and feeding them to the children. It should be the school system should be something that nurtures students, like every participant within the school from beginning to end of their time in that school. And it goes back more than 5 years. I mean, we're feeling it now, but it
Oh yeah.
starts with neoliberal ed reform. When we saw how education evaluation systems changed, I want to say it was probably as early as like '04, '05, when they were starting to push the the educator as the problem. They started thinking like most teachers were not good at their jobs and most administrators weren't good at their jobs. So we have to have these evaluation systems. They're designed from that perspective so that we can fix the mid performers and get rid of the bad performers. And that deprofessionalization that's been going on for 20 years is the thing that really started the slide that we're really now feeling. Like we had in '04 is when we started cresting the hill on the roller coaster. You're not going so fast yet, but then all of a sudden it takes off, and
Yeah.
that's where we are now. We're at the bottom of the hill now, and we're going really fast. Um, so I think that the first big shift has to be stop worrying so much about the students, and really focus on how do we empower the adults to do the job, and then see what the results are with that. Because most of the work that school reform still focuses on is what kind of curriculum are we going to use, or what kind of pedagogy do we need, and it's not that. It's how do we empower shared decision making and collective leadership within those schools, because the typical hierarchical model just lobotomizes your organization. You have like
Mhm.
5% of the professionals doing the thinking and everyone else doing the work, and the people who are doing the thinking are separated from the work because they're not in the classrooms in the day to day. And it's that's the thing that really needs to change.
Well, we knew we could count on you to be disagreeable, Mike, and thank you for that. I hope you can still find work in education by saying it's not really about the kids.
That's my whole job right now, and I love
I
it.
know, and I agree with you completely. Nadine, it looked like you wanted to jump in a couple of times as Mike
Oh
was
yeah,
talking,
I
so
felt like
please
a
do.
bobblehead, totally agreeing with Mike on all of that he was saying. I also wear the union hat, the building rep, and on the organizing committee in our local union. And you know, maybe the way it was phrased of saying it's not about the kids, it's about the adults, I might not word it quite that way. But when I'm thinking about things in terms of like social emotional learning for kids, we got to think also about social emotional learning and mental health wellness for the adults. There's a lot of disparity for teachers as well. Some teachers are very highly supported and have wellness programs and excellent professional development programs, and other teachers work in schools where that isn't the case, right? But when we think about social emotional learning, if you're not healthy, if you're not strong, if you're not supported, then you can't be there for the ones you want to serve, right? And so sometimes we feel like it's selfish to take care of ourselves and take that time for ourselves because we're supposed to be focused on the kids all the time, but you can't be if you haven't taken care of yourself, if you haven't prepared yourself, if you haven't been supported yourself. And that's the message I took from what Mike was saying. I'm just wording it maybe in a little more agreeable way.
And I want to add on top of that, Nadine and
Yeah.
Mike, that if you cannot afford to live comfortably, and I'm not saying very high upper middle class, but if you cannot afford to live comfortably where you know that your housing is secure and your food intake is secure, and our teaching staff really, our beginning teaching staff really are looking at that, what is the incentive to stay in the field? Our teachers inherently want to be there. They would not have gotten educated, gone through everything they need to do through teacher training to be in the education field if they didn't want to be there. So they're leaving at rapid rates, one, because they can't afford to stay. Or two, they're not prepared and the school districts are not prepared to support them in the social emotional aspect. And I completely agree with Mike and Nadine and what they're saying on that.
Yeah,
I think Sarah introduces a new word, disrespected.
Yeah. And that's come up
Yeah.
in previous conversations, most certainly.
Yeah, and it's just like Nadine, I agree with all the things that you were saying about being able to like take care of yourself and manage your own well-being. But there's another half to that too. Like it doesn't matter how good you are at taking care of yourself if the system within you work is toxic. And so like that and that's the thing that I think we really need to focus on as professionals is reorienting those systems so that they are supportive rather than toxic. I was looking for a diss word and I just didn't have it.
It's okay. We've had lots of diss words, and I just have to say, Mike, I'm really glad you raised that issue about the inability to take care of yourself when the system that you're working in is toxic, right? I think the system that we live in now is the result of a realization that the system that preceded it was toxic and was unsustainable, right? Unsustainable on the scale that we needed education to be. It was equally hard on the women primarily who were involved in the system before the Committee of 10 reforms in 1888. They were basically wards of their community and living on public assistance. It was equally hard on the kids. It was very abusive, very disciplinary, right? Like we made a lot of changes during the progressive movement. And our hope with this conversation is that people who are listening will be inspired to think about making changes on that scale, right? Rather than accepting that, well, this seems to be working for the vast majority of people. So let's just leave it in place and figure out what we can do to make life easier for the people it's not working for. And that's going to take some discord on the part of people in their schools that we talked about. And I sure hope that it's not what Sarah talked about with people bailing out of the profession, right? Because those are the voices we probably need more than anything else is the people who are fed up. Rather than walking away, we need them to fight up. But Dana, any thoughts from you as we head into final words here?
Yeah, I would just say that, that every conversation that we've had has been so different and so revealing in a lot of ways. And this one has been great. And I keep going back to that word, even though it's not a diss word in any way, shape, or form, is the support piece. And that focus on supporting adults so that it trickles down to our learners. And I think that that's something that we really discuss with a lot of our school systems that we work with is we're here to support your teachers. And that in supporting those teachers, that's when we'll find, and I don't know what happened to Tim, but that's really where we will find the greatest growth happening is once we have those support pieces in place. And those are hard discussions to have with administrators because or even higher ups in terms of the system, sometimes when we're talking about grant awards and that sort of thing, because they want to just see what is it directly for the students. And we have spent a lot of time talking about how you have to have that support first with the teachers in place, because then it changes the entire way that classrooms are run, leading to more success within the school systems themselves. But Tim, glad you're back. You're muted though.
My dogs think it's dinner time. But I just wanted to really quickly add a new element here as we wrap up. Nadine, would you stick with your original diss word, or did you hear one that you liked better today? Would you stick with disparity?
I feel even more strongly about disparity now because initially arrived knowing about the disparity for teachers, educators, and all kinds of staff members that support teachers and educators that work in a school. But the forefront of my mind, because I've been trained to think of the kids first, the disparity for them. And there is the disparity for staff and teachers and educators at all levels as well. And if we don't support them, if we don't provide all the things they need for not just their social emotional wellness, but how about their professional wellness as well?
Mm-hmm. Mike, how about you? You stick with Discord, or did you hear one you liked better today?
I have another one in my mind. I don't know if it's one that I heard today, but it's disassemble. You know, how do we start taking apart these things? But take them apart in an intentional way. You know, we're not coming in with a wrecking ball. But instead, how do we intentionally start to disassemble or these? Oh, I guess dismantle was said too. So yeah, dismantle. Yeah. So how do we start to dismantle these things that that aren't serving us and build something new? Yeah. And how do we empower folks to solve their own problems? Now, it's not like how do we take care of the teachers, but how do we make it so teachers can take care of themselves, yeah, and face their own challenges. So what are we going to disassemble? What are we going to dismantle that's in the way? And what are we going to build in its place?
Yeah, I like that. I'm seeing like labels on all the school buildings that say disassembly may be required or something like that, right? So, Sarah, what about you? Do you stick with disenchantment, or did you hear something that you liked?
I am going to stick with just disenchantment, but I think
Yep.
I'm going to just have one final comment that as we work on disassembling, that to really encourage our teachers and our professionals to lead where they are in the moment. So if we have more people that are stepping up to lead, even if it's in a small space, we can start to make shifts in the overall systems in general.
Well said. I thank you all for leading in the moment and going with the free-form nature of the conversation here. I think we surfaced a lot of interesting possibilities. It's been really great having you on DIST, and we hope that we'll have this up over the weekend, maybe at the latest. Last words, Dana?
Hey, like I said before, every conversation is different. And in November, I had no idea where my call for disagreeable people was going to go. But I'm so happy that it has led to DIST in these conversations, because I remember when I walked away from the classroom and saying specifically to my principal, make me want to stay, help me to grow. And I didn't feel like I was getting that growth in the place where I was, but it's these types of conversations that help me to grow as a professional. So on that note, I am also very thankful for all of you joining us. And it's been a wonderful, little less than an hour conversation.